think the conversation around sustainable development goals is very useful because in a way it sets a global agenda on what are things we as humanity care about, right? In a way, that sort of humanity's to-do list. And it's useful to start from there because then at least you can say, I'm not imagining up a need. This is a need that's well recognized through an international process, a collaborative process. But importantly, the goal here is not to make sure that you in your annual statement get to say, or in your annual report, get to say that 7 of these goals are met by me versus somebody else's organization is only hitting 4 of those, right? That cannot be the KPI. And it's amazing how often that does become the KPI. Like I am hitting 7 out of the 17 goals and so on. And at a minimum, you need to double click, and you need to double click and say, what are the specific indicators that I'm going after within that. In this case, let's say you care about maternal mortality ratio, and you just say, okay, and the good news is globally it's a priority. And then you have to identify where is the need the most. And arguably you will be able to make a bigger difference in working on that issue if it's in Nigeria than in Singapore, because in Singapore, 8 out of 100,000 women die while giving birth to a child, while that number is 917 in Nigeria. Of course, you still need to ask the question, are your skills equally relevant in Nigeria as in Singapore? But it's about starting with the real question of the real node and the real need. And that's just one of the points. Carsten, I agree. So that's not my point of view, just to be clear. This is one point of view, which is called the effective altruism, which is look for the opportunity where you would make the most difference. There's very good differences to do otherwise and to be directly involved. If anything, we are human beings. We might not be able to sustain ourselves working in a job, for example, which we don't like, and expecting that we'll be able to fund something else for 20 years. There might be other reasons. To the extent that that job, changes yourself as a person in a way that you don't want to, maybe you wouldn't do that, right? So the point here is, I'm not saying that that's necessarily the best thing to do. All I'm saying is that that's the argument that one particular movement makes, which is sort of which is called the effective effective altruism movement. We'll have time for sort of a longer discussion. Let me go through a few more slides, and then I'm going to pause for reactions on this or any other thing. But one of the things that I want to highlight, and I want to highlight this because I think we as humanity are not paying enough attention to, which is, I think it's reasonable to get specialized in a particular sort of objective, like one of the sustainable development goals, and double clicking on it and so on. But one should not lose sight of the fact that these goals are actually very often very interrelated. And the reason I say that is highlighted in a little bit of what happened at COP26. If any of you saw the live coverage that was happening on the last day, right? It should not have been a surprise that we ended up where we ended up, because for many days leading up to the final day, that was exactly the conversation, which is the poorer countries were saying, look, hang on, the climate problem is essentially caused by the rich people in the richer countries, right? So here's some of the statistics. The richest 1% of the people, most of which historically, not anymore, but historically were based in the richer countries, are projected in 2030 to still have, despite all the noise around net zero and all of that, 30 times the per capita CO2 emissions that we need to reach the 1.5% target. And look at the global average, which is still above, which means that we are not on track for 1.5%. And the poorest 50% are way below that level, right? So climate change is almost entirely a problem caused by the rich people. Now, this is the argument, not surprisingly, a lot of the poor countries would do. And there are different segments of these countries, right? Some are in countries which are, small island countries which are literally going to disappear in 50 years if the water levels rise. But then, there's another category, and on the last day, this particularly became an issue with India opposing the issue of coal and making people say, no, we can't phase out coal, but in the end, we will agree to phase down coal, which is reduce emphasis on coal. Because they said, hang on, we don't have the money to overnight switch to renewable energies. Our economy is dependent on coal. Finally, we are at a point where we are starting to have reasonable economic growth. And, the average Indian today might have, the same aspiration for standard of living that people in Europe and US have had for 20 years. So what gives you the right to stop us from doing something that you guys have done from decades, right? So that was that side of the argument. And the important point here is, without going into the details of the politics that subsequently ensued, that there are always multiple perspectives. And very often these perspectives are coming from different pieces in the SDGs. Saying, if the Indian perspective was, if we focus too much on climate, we are not able to, have progress as fast as we could on other dimensions. For example, we need the energy, we need the houses to build so that, we solve the problem of housing that a lot of low-income people might have. We need the infrastructure, we need the roads to be able to build our economy and create jobs and all of that, right? So again, the point here is neither to defend India, not to criticize India, but to say that these things are complex. And if you're passionate about climate, the real question to be asking is not how to make Amsterdam a little bit more green. I think, in my view, your time and resources would be much better spent on saying, how do we help figure out a global system where, India finds it in their interest to make Delhi more green. And, that it's already a big problem. And of course, it's not that it's not recognized, but in the priority order, because, we are living on the same earth end of the day. And the issue of development is very intertwined with the issue of climate, right? And this is a point that's made very strongly by this highly influential book by Kate Raworth, which is summarized in one of her TED Talks, which I highly recommend. And she says, we have to view sort of the global challenge that we face across all sustainable development goals like a donut, right? And some of these sustainable development goals are about the outer boundary of the donut that we shouldn't push outside, which is how much can the earth handle in terms of resource utilization or emissions that we generate and so on, while the inner foundation is sort of the minimum standard of living that we as humanity have to strive for all of us. And it, in the end, has to simultaneously sort of meet that balance. This is where I think a good starting point of a conversation about business is to bring into picture somebody like Muhammad Yunus, who says, hang on. And as you probably know, Professor Yunus and the Grameen Bank won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2006. And his whole point of view is, it's not about business being good or bad. Business is just a tool. It's your choice how you use the tool. And, you can choose to use the tool in a way that it's not just profit maximizing, but it's working towards societal objectives, right? So one of the case studies that I use in my teaching when I talk about it, is a poster child of this movement, which Professor Yunus started, which is called social entrepreneurship, but now very often people prefer the word impact entrepreneurship, is this hospital chain, which does about 500,000 surgeries a year, sees about 5 million patients a year, which is called Arvind Eye Care, which is not donor funded. It's completely self-sustaining, but through a cross-subsidized model and through a very professionally run organization, which applies the best principles that you would learn, let's say in operations management class at a business school, but combines that with the passion that derives very strongly from spirituality, which is in the DNA of this organization, right? So this organization doesn't make money, it cross-subsidizes, and its focus is on serving even the poorest with the same quality of service clinically, which actually matches clinical outcomes in the UK when it comes to things like cataract surgery. So their focus is very deliberately something that's low cost and high impact intervention, in particular cataract surgery, which we take for granted is available to everywhere, even in India, in the cities, even in middle class. But it turns out not to be the case in a lot of the rural low-income communities in emerging markets, where just this $20 surgery that could have saved eyesight, the absence of that leads to people going blind. So just to give another example, and I'll pause for questions just in another couple of minutes, just after I throw in some more examples. We are among the Dutch Alumni Association events. So a natural example that comes up is Tony Chocolonely, which is the largest chocolate brand in Holland. It's excellent chocolate. At the same time, the whole company actually was started, if you go back to the history of the company, it was started by, I think it was a journalist or a lawyer, I'm forgetting. But the motivation was that we want to build a chocolate company that's ethical in terms of minimizing human trafficking, raising awareness around human trafficking in the cocoa supply chain and working on minimizing it. And the whole brand is built around doing well. At the same time, while making sure it's an excellent product. And that's an important point here, right? So they're not compromising on the quality of the product because we're the do-gooders. And their broader mission is to make all chocolate slave-free, not just theirs, right? So it's a little bit of an activist brand, just like, Patagonia would be in outdoor clothing. Now, the difference between this case and the Arvind's case is this is also being built as a profitable business, right? So the aspiration, whether it's Tony's or whether it's Patagonia, and we can think of many other examples, is to ultimately build a business which is good at doing impact, but in a way that's embedded with the promise in the business school, in the business model or the brand, that it achieves that impact and building a profitable business at the same time. So just in terms of a little bit of a vocabulary, I like to make this distinction. These are not necessarily, scientifically defined perfect terms that everybody agrees, but I like to make this distinction between a social enterprise, a term that I use for an organization that's putting impact first, and putting impact first in a context where they see trade-offs and they choose to give up on profitability to have that impact. And Arvind would be an example of that, because they would feel that, yes, we could make more money by serving less of the poorest patients that we are providing surgeries for free through a cross-subsidy model, but we don't care as much about the money as about the impact. So we're going to stay with that. And impact business would be somebody like Tony Chocolonely or Patagonia, says our brand promise, our business model fundamentally embeds in it our approach towards impact in a way that there isn't a trade-off, or at least there isn't much of a trade-off, that I can simultaneously build a profitable business at the same time as having impact. Now, the thing that I want to contrast this with is a third category, which is where typically most of the larger public companies would fall, which I'll call sustainable business, where for everything you invariably have to end up justifying why it's consistent with making money, at least in the long term, and consistent with shareholder value. And we've seen leaders pushing the frontier of that. We saw Paul Polman at Unilever. We saw the CEO of Danone. But not surprisingly, in the end, these are all cases where they did sort of have friction with the shareholders to some extent, and it ends up being a delicate balance. Having said that, for a lot of us, especially the ones that work in large companies, it's important to recognize that, yes, the stories of impact entrepreneurship and social entrepreneurship might seem sexy. And for sure, there are a lot of circumstances in which there's a lot of impact being made, but it goes back to the question on, am I an entrepreneur? Am I willing to live that kind of lifestyle? Am I willing to go into that kind of venture, or am I just better at making impact inside larger companies? Now that impact might be slower impact, more incremental impact, but potentially at a much bigger scale. So again, your impact, given depending on your skills and the issues you tackle, might be larger in these large companies. Just to take a couple of quick examples, if you're at Amazon and you can help Amazon supply chain become better, or you can help improve the facial recognition software at Amazon that came into a lot of criticism for being, to some extent, almost biased against darker skin colors. By the way, this is an issue that has also come up more recently with oximeters, if you've been following BBC. Oximeters, which measure the oxygen level in COVID, it turns out that they are much more accurate with lighter skin than darker skin, right? So this has been sort of a huge global debate as well, right? So this is about, okay, the business already exists. There's a large public business, but invariably the business has a lot of effects on society. And if you can help make a positive difference, in other words, if you can help reduce even the negative effects, that's also impact, because the world is better because of you, right? You don't need the sexy social entrepreneurship stories to say you're having necessarily an impact. Similarly, another example that I've been following recently is Lego, right? So if Lego can make more of its bricks from recycled materials, going more towards a circular economy, or if it can help change the perceptions that of gender roles, a lot of which can be traced back to the toys that children get to play, boys versus girls, when they are 3-year-old, when the blue versus pink distinction starts to get made, you're already having an impact on the dimension of gender as a toy company if you're highlighting that issue. And if you're able to highlight in a way that is consistent both with your mission, but also, with making more money, then there doesn't necessarily need to be a trade-off. So, just to summarize this part of the discussion, and here I'll sort of give another pause. So the way I look at the world is that it's a little bit of a spectrum, right? The spectrum on the right-hand side of the spectrum is what I call the invisible hand of the market, where nobody is sitting and saying, what impact am I having on the world, right? So you can imagine the telephone companies, and the mobile phone companies going to sub-Saharan Africa in the earlier years. They went there because that was a large potential market, and they ended up having a huge impact by enabling, financial inclusion, by enabling access to markets for farmers and connectivity for farmers, and so on, right? So there's still value being created. So the question is not whether the impact is more on the right or the left, but it's different approaches. And typically we used to think of, there's this invisible hand, Adam Smith market playing, or there is this charity and intentional impact. But I think a lot of the action, and what gets a lot of my students excited in my MBA courses, is the action in the middle. And different people very often might have different preferences or, different aptitude for whether I want to have impact through social enterprise, through an impact business or a sustainable business. But it's important to emphasize that one is not better than the other. They're just different. So you have to go back to the same 3 questions we started with. What real need are you helping fulfill? And is this the right vehicle for that? Does it align with what you're trying to achieve in your life, financial goals and impact goals? And does this align with what your own skills, competitive advantage, resources, and capabilities are?
I think it's maybe it's a question that can't be answered right here, but I think the examples you've taken us through are sort of interesting and inspiring. For me, I think the gap is, it still seems like people have quit their day job and started a chocolate company, and quit their day job and done something. So for me, I think more inspiring examples would be, to make it real in my head, is
right.
How do I create impact, right? Like,
right.
I have an MBA. I'm not a particularly skilled person.
Yeah.
I'm not gonna. How do I do that?
Yeah. So I mean, to me, it goes back to, right, this is the point that I was trying to make here, right? If you're doing supply chain in Amazon, and you can help crack the issue of why are we using so much packaging, and can we accomplish the same customer service goals If I'm coding AI algorithms at Amazon, am I sensitive to the fact that there is this unintended side consequence? And just to take an extreme example, if I was doing self-driving coding for self-driving cars at in Tesla, now it is also a reality that some people have tested some of these algorithms, and it turns out the algorithms are better at detecting lighter skin color than darker skin color. Now think about the implications of that, right? Think about the implications of the kind of accidents that a car would have. And so the point again is, I think just being sensitive, any job touches society in more ways than we realize, right? So normally a supply chain person at Amazon, much less so a software coder at Amazon or Google, would think about the biases its code might be producing, or somebody who's marketing toys at a toy company might be doing. So this is sort of the current version of capitalism in which we are, and that we will be, at least in the near future. So the question to me is, will this solve the world's problem? And no, the business on its own will not solve the world's problem. The distinction to me, and by the way, with the disclaimer that these boundaries are blurry, and incidentally, exactly the same story holds on the finance side, right? So I could do a lecture on impact investing. It would be exactly the same conversation, saying, is sustainable, responsible investing or impact investing, impact business, sustainable business is going to save the world? No. Are social enterprises going to save the world? No, it will always be too small, right? So what's needed? I mean, what's needed is all of this, but not to a point where it crowds out, let's say, policy, right? It crowds out the role of governments. I think the most dangerous narrative is, since these guys are doing it, governments don't need to do anything. And I would argue that today, all the noise that's happening, especially around net zero, right, around sustainable business, about everybody's getting so excited about ESG. Part of the reason is that they can see the writing on the wall. The regulation is coming. It's already there in Europe, pretty much, right? And so it has become like, okay, the regulation is coming in 3, 4, 5 years. So if I don't clean up my act now, and my competitors do, in 3 years, I'll be out of business, because the competitors will already be meeting the regulatory requirements, and I will not be, right? So I don't think Shell is talking about net zero from the goodness of their heart, right? In some abstract sense, right? Given the system, they are doing it because it just makes sense that, once the regulatory framework tightened, there is a clear business case. So I would argue that this business case that I was talking about inside the company, making that business case becomes easier when there's the right regulatory framework, the right systems level conversations. And by the way, a lot of it can also be just sector level. It doesn't necessarily have to be regulatory, but then it has to be pre-competitive, right? Then you're not saying, hey, I'm the good guy who takes on, in some settings, there's a win-win, but in other settings, there's a real cost. And if I'm the guy who takes on the cost, and the implication of that is I go out of business because the other guy is now more competitive, then what have we achieved as a society? And the solution is, we have to find a way to level the playing field. One way is to do more sector level efforts, for sure, which will take us, I think, further than individual level efforts. But then the another layer is, we absolutely need government action and so on. I think the way EU is thinking about it is exactly in the right direction. The tricky thing is, just like markets fail, I think the governments also fail, right? Especially when it comes to collaboration around regulation, because the goals are different, right? Europe and US is panicking about environment. India cares about environment, but India also cares about development, and that already creates some divergence in how fast does coal need to go off the face of Earth, right? So I think it's not that this is wrong. I think this is incomplete. So, but I'm obviously focusing on this because, I'm thinking more from the business point of view. But at a minimum, what we need to make sure is business doesn't undermine regulatory efforts. And I think that's the most dangerous thing, where there's active lobbying behind the scenes. Some people would argue the reason the final text of COP26 talks about coal but not oil is that the oil lobby is just too strong still. Coal is just not strong enough. So you were able to bring coal in. Why is there no mention of phasing out oil in there? Because there's just too many powerful countries and too many powerful companies that still have a stake on the ground in oil. The issue is not about, I think, some person sitting in the chair solving all of the world's problems. I think it's about the people that are in power, which is people like us, people like, businesses rule the world. The reality, that's the reality. There's a large enough fraction of that people, A, that should care, B, be well informed on the issues, because just caring is not enough. Because with caring, the problem is you will end up spending your time and energy doing things which in the bigger scheme of things are not solving the problems. And you're feeling good about yourself. And, one of the examples I give here, this was my next slide. So, it's a natural transition, if I may give that, is this issue of environmental impact, right? And, a lot of people are just saying, hey, we're flying more, let's start doing carbon offset, problem solved, right? And that's a very cheap trick. Carbon offsets is not going to save the world, right? That's just the reality. But it's one of those things that if we don't sufficiently, it's a well-meaning initiative for most of us, right? We just say, no, I do need to fly. And I'm not saying that we should fly or shouldn't fly. We are all on our journeys. But at the systems level, there are too many things wrong with this. One is, A, the pricing is wrong, right? Carbon offsets are way too cheap relative to what scientists say needs to be done. And B, it, by the way, accentuates the inequality problem, because effectively what you're saying is the rich will not change their behavior, but they are going to pay off the poor people so that they don't generate more carbon footprint, right? I mean, that's sort of one interpretation of some of this, right? So what's happening here is, if you go back to this, I mean, this is the fundamental challenge. Just purely looking at the emissions part of the climate debate, right? Which is the atmosphere, think of it as a bathtub, and the carbon is the water in the bathtub. And the reality, if you look at the budget for a 1.5% future, we've filled up half of this bathtub, right? So the question is, how far are we going to continue filling up the bathtub? Who's going to fill up the bathtub? How far will we empty the water? Because the faster we empty the water, the more we can continue to fill the bathtub. And who's going to, empty the bathtub? And this becomes important, because now if you go back to this question of net zero pledges, the details are in the fine print. How are people achieving the net zero pledges? So in this case, if you're inside a business, you can think of 3 ways you can say, I'm going to hit net zero. The first is, and that's the cheapest trick, but that's becoming very hard now because everybody now talks about scope 3 emissions and so on, is just simply saying, I'm going to get out of the parts of the value chain where the pollution is happening. I'm going to focus on the clean stuff, right? But that you get called out on. So that's the first one, right? Which is, this solves nothing because your value chain is still there. You just don't own it. You're not showing it on your books. The second is the offsetting emissions. And there also, there are a lot of problems. Do you really believe when a fossil fuel company says, my natural gas is carbon neutral because I have planted some trees somewhere? There's so many challenges with that issue, right? Carbon offsets is a really complex territory. First, just planting trees at the expense of ecosystems doesn't work. Second, even if you're planting trees, who's guaranteeing the trees will be there for like the next 40 years? Because if the trees are going to be either cut down by somebody or burned down in a forest fire in a few years, you have achieved absolutely nothing. Then if you plant more trees here, if the people that were going to cut trees in this forest now cut the trees somewhere else, you've again achieved nothing, right, at the systems level. And finally, by the way, if you're paying somebody to adopt renewable energy and there's already a business case for renewable energy that they would have adopted, your additionality, to use the jargon from this space, is zero, right? So, and the point again is not to say that offsetting emissions doesn't have a role, but it's one of those things again, that it's a band-aid And it's a transition device that, once you make sure it's sufficiently high quality, has a useful role to play as we transition towards net zero. But that in itself is not going to, solve the climate crisis. So we absolutely need to be thinking about reducing emissions. So where is that in the business world? In the business world, roughly there are two categories of things that are happening. One is sort of the Bill Gates view of the world. And I like his approach of break it down by sector, look at what is the green premium, and very selectively using philanthropic capital or concessionary capital to enable innovation to reduce this quote unquote green premium, so that the more carbon neutral technologies come closer in cost to the carbon positive technologies. And then, of course, there's this conversation more broadly about the circular economy. And, we as consumers need to be consuming less. But, more importantly, as a system, the entire system should be built in a way that, products have longer lives. You're not building what you don't need to build, you repair more, and ultimately recycle more, right? But recycling should not be a feel-good sort of thing. Recycle comes last in the order of things in which you reduce your carbon footprint on the world. And while all of this is happening, one of the things to again recognize is this just Band-Aid, or will this really solve the problem? And I think here it's somewhat strongly written, but I find this book useful. This is one of the books that I read this year, The New Climate War from Michael Mann. And what his point of view is, actually, we have to be a little bit careful. We need to hold the companies more accountable, because right now there's too much focus on the individual and reducing individual carbon footprint, which, while important, is not enough. And then in this particular book, which has been highlighted elsewhere as well, he gives the example of, there was this campaign called the Crying Indian Ad in the US in the 1970s, I think, or 80s, when plastic bottles had just, plastic litter was becoming a big problem. And there was legislation on the cards that the state governments in the US would hold the software companies, for example, accountable for making sure that they go and bring the plastic back, rather than the plastic just sort of causing all the litter everywhere. And at least in one version of the story, a lot of these campaigns, which were putting individual responsibility at the center to say, look what you've done, you've taken the land from which, the native Indians used to preserve as natural land, and you've completely littered it. So we need to get better at cleaning up our litter and all of that. That was the messaging. It turns out that the funding of a lot of those campaigns was ultimately coming, at least in the version that I've read in a few sources, ultimately coming from the Coca-Colas of the world, right? Which is, corporates were essentially framing the issue as an individual responsibility issue, so that business didn't have to do anything. And by the way, a very similar story has happened with the personal carbon footprint. That's a term that was devised by BP, right? Think about it, right? An oil company, why would an oil company in a big way push this whole agenda of individual footprint? Because then it's not the oil company's responsibility anymore, right? So, and this is not to say individual responsibility is not important, but this is exactly why it shouldn't replace systems level change and policy level responsibility and so on. Karsten, go ahead. Karsten, you're still muted.
So, yes, first of all, thank you very much, Jasjit. You're really, well, putting us to think again where we are in this world. I don't know really where to start, but one of the things is that I see a dilemma between the way we have organized society today, which is free enterprise and liberalism, which, by the way, in the heart, I still very much support, but at the same time, liberalism and capitalism is at the expense of societal needs and liberalism of others, right? So I was wondering what your view on this is, because as you say, it's not going to be enough that we have social entrepreneurialism and what have you. So yeah. So yes, please.
Okay,
Your
thank
view
you.
on this.
I couldn't have planted better questions, because your questions keep on going back to the next PowerPoint slide I have. So I get to show all of my slides anyway. Okay, so this, I promise this is the last stretch, but I think it directly relates to your point and shares my point of view. My point of view is, and this is what we were talking about, right? A lot of what's happening in terms of initiatives is sort of happening at the top or the middle of this iceberg, right? And a lot of the action is at the bottom of the iceberg. Now, and this is the kind of diagram the systems thinking people like to say, saying, it's ultimately about much more fundamental transformation. Now, the question then becomes, what is a more fundamental transformation, right? One is, if you go to the real extreme, then somebody will say, capitalism has failed. I mean, but that's like, okay, but tell me the alternative, right? So we've tried alternatives and they've done worse than capitalism, right? So capitalism has failed, except that it's better than everything else that we've tried out. It's a little bit like democracy. People talk about democracy as well, right? And so to me, the question goes back to, my view is, I think it has to be, so first of all, I'm a huge fan of this notion of intentionality, right? I think business is a tool, end of the day. I think if there's enough business people who are thinking about it as a tool in a system where the employees, the customers, the communities, the policymakers, they're all sufficiently sensitive to really understanding what's happening in the society as a whole and raising awareness, right? So just raising awareness. So for example, right now, if most of the campaigns are about, as long as you recycle your plastic bottles, it's okay to keep on consuming more plastic bottles. Those are problematic, right? But my view is, I think a combination of people who genuinely want to make a positive difference, even within the business community, and those people being supported by a broader societal context, more educated customers, more educated communities, more educated employees, combined with a tighter regulatory framework that supports the good guys that want to do the right things. I think you need all of those pieces to work together. And I think what we don't need, and I'll put in this picture, I mean, just to say what I'm contrasting this with. So, and the reason I have this picture of an auto rickshaw driver in Mumbai, this is not this specific guy. I mean, I picked this picture up off the net. But what had happened was, I went to one of the MBA class trips to India, building business in India, right? So there's this building business MBA courses, right? And we were sitting in a 5-star hotel at night. People were having $20 tequila shots and bragging about how they were able to use their skills from the MBA negotiations course to get better prices out of the auto rickshaw drivers in Mumbai who were asking for $2, and these guys were able to negotiate it down to $1 for like a 15-minute ride, and feeling proud about it. I think that's where the problem is, right? Which is, I think there's something fundamentally wrong with that. And to the extent that we at business schools are guilty of accepting and perhaps even encouraging that way of thinking, I think it's a problem. I think it has to start first with getting back to our humanity. And then the second is getting back to this notion that when we are doing impact, we're not doing anybody any favor, right? And I think we need to have much more education in ethics. That's my view in particular, and philosophy, right? On what is a good life. And this, in particular, John Rawls defines justice as saying, okay, if we didn't know what we are going to be born as, right? The lottery of birth had not happened. What is the system we would design, right? And if we approach this whole notion that way, right? recognizing that I'm successful, maybe because I'm smart. Even that one can question how much credit I can take for. But certainly to some extent, I was born in a supportive family. I got to go to good schools. I got the right opportunity. I was lucky enough to crack an exam that took me to the right college. Some admissions officer picked my application file rather than somebody else, even though both of those files were equally good and all of that. I think once you go with that attitude rather than impact as something doing somebody else a favor, I think it has to go back to those values and humility. Ultimately, one of the things that I was talking even last week when I was teaching to INSEAD Social Entrepreneurship Program, I said, in my view, the single most important skill that's needed to have social impact is humility. I mean, it's not obvious, right? There's a lot of people who would put a lot of skills before that. But I think when people are coming from a sense of arrogance and I know better and this is how life should be, which I see, to be honest, a lot of people in the business world, when they come into the sustainability impact world, they bring, some of them end up bringing those values that you guys, you don't know what climate change is. You guys don't understand how poverty will be solved. I built the largest company in the world, and here I am now. I'm going to tell you how to use those skills to solve the problems you've been working on because I'm just smarter than you, and you have nothing to teach me. And I think that's where the real issue lies. Anyway, I don't know if it's useful, but I think that's how I'm thinking. I mean, I've been struggling with this. This is a very hard problem. But I don't think the answer is to give up on business, because I don't think we have a better solution. I think the issue is business as a tool, but I think business as a tool can be usefully employed only if people are going to reward the good guys, which requires a combination of educating the people on what really is a good guy versus who is just acting to be a good guy, and a regulatory framework that also keeps incentives sufficiently aligned with that.
Jasjit, I don't want to interrupt you, but I think that's a fantastic place to finish.
Yeah, and I noticed we had plans to do group work as well, but I think we ended up having a lot of exciting discussion just in the forum. So we'll just leave it at that. Yeah.
Well, I thank you again. I think that was remarkably thought-provoking. And it will probably take time actually for it to settle in and for us to reflect on the amount of material that's gone through in the last 90 minutes. Particularly, it causes us to think about what is impact and what does business as a force for good really mean. You know, clearly good intentions aren't good enough, but how do you turn good intentions into impact? Another important theme. And two things to finish with. It's one, that identifying the social need is absolutely critical, and I thank you for reiterating that. And your final point about humility, I think, is one that again we need to reflect on and our own approach. So, fantastic way to spend an hour and a half, really timely for us. Thank you very much for your input here. Okay, well, with that, thank you again, Jasjit. And
thank you, Jasjit.
Thank you.
Bring
Bye,
this
everyone.
to a close.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.